It is lovely to see so many of you here, and we're very packed in. It was a very popular session this year, so it's lovely to see so many of you. I think we have one more ticket holder to come, so someone may arrive in a moment or two, but that's then it. We will then lock the doors. So, so welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Thomas, I'm chair of the Manor House Trust, and I'm delighted to welcome Lucia Smith today. Lucia and I have known one another for quite a few years now. Lucia was one of the founder members of the Ilkley Art Trail, and I worked with Lucia several times on many occasions with the art trail, so it's lovely to be welcoming you for the second time to the Manor House to talk about this particular quest. I asked Lucia to send me some words about the talk so I could give you a flavour of what Lucia was going to be talking about today, and actually I think the simplest thing is if I read you Lucia's words, because they expressed it so well. I don't think I'm going to be able to improve on them.
Okay, that's great.
So, Lucia's Dales Odyssey became her personal quest, and although her expectation was she would try to paint all the Dales, she told me she wasn't even sure if that would be possible. Time and energy may not allow it. And she certainly didn't expect her curiosity to take her on side quests into geology, history and literature. But with names like Kingsdale and Apedale to conjure with, and headlines like The Dale That Died, the quest became an unexpected, glorious adventure, and she was compelled to find out more, lots of which she will share with us this morning.
Indeed.
So I'm going to hand to Lucia to take us through that quest and that glorious adventure. So over to you, Lucia.
Thank you, Sarah. I was going to thank you for your kind words, but actually they were Hello everybody, and thank you very much for being here. Yes, this story this morning that I'm going to share with you is going to be about how I became a landscape painter, why I use soft pastels, and that's a curious combination, being a landscape painter and choosing to use soft pastels, why I became fascinated by the Yorkshire Dales, and why I set out to try to paint all the named dales of the Yorkshire Dales National Park. Now, I've got quite a few familiar faces in the audience, and some of them have promised not to heckle me, which is really, really nice. Thank you, dear friends. But obviously, if you have questions as we go along, pressing questions, do put your hand up and I'll try to answer them. But if we can save most of the questions to the end, I'll try and have a good slug for questions and answers at the end, so that would help me. So let's take you back to 40 years ago. I was living in Australia and I was reading widely at the time. I was trying to empower myself to become that elusive thing, an artist. I hadn't done an arts degree, so I was trying to sort of replace that gap. And I was reading widely. I found in the library Gombrich's huge book that's called The History of Art, and I read it diligently, cover to cover, took lots of notes, and I learnt a lot. But next to it on the library shelf was this little book by Australian artist John Newell. It's called The Living Canvas. And this little book actually was a lot more impactful on me. And in it, John Newell says, you cannot be an artist. Well, obviously that was a bit of a horrifying thing to read at that time, but he goes on to explain, you cannot be an artist, you have to live your life first, and then you can become an artist. Well, there I was in my 20s, and I thought, okay, I can do that. I love exploring, I love being curious, I love learning new things, and I love walking. So let's carry on doing those things and see what happens. So I set out on a bewildering array of short courses of different art techniques. So I enrolled in life drawing, and that was hard and challenging, but I enjoyed it and I learnt a great deal. I enrolled on oil painting landscape techniques. That was difficult as well, and I learnt about the trials and tribulations of oil painting. I mean, I absolutely love the palette knife and the brush strokes and so on, but you have to wait for things to dry, and if you want that exact colour another time, you have to know how you mixed it the first time to mix it again. So it was complicated. I did a lovely course on still life, and I enjoyed that because here was something that was observational, but I could also put my emotion into it, which I began to realise is something I wanted to do. And then, weirdly, I embarked on a course of Chinese watercolour brush techniques. Now that was completely different. I knew it was going to be disciplined, and indeed it was. We sat in long rows, and you had to have your wrist at a certain angle. You had to use your bamboo brush just at the right, just so to paint the bamboo leaves or the carp or the blossom. And I really, really enjoyed that. The Chinese teacher, who was a man, would walk up and down the rows, and if you got the angle of your wrist just a bit wrong, he would tap it with a ruler. I mean, yeah, so it was disciplined. But again, I learnt a lot, but I also learnt that the problem with it was that if you made an error right towards the end of your beautiful painting, there was nothing you could do to save the painting, because this watercolour paper is so fine and so delicate, so you have to screw it up and start again. So that didn't feel like where I was going. Finally, I enrolled on a longer course of portraiture. Now, golly, yes, that was challenging. I again learnt a lot and I loved it, but here's the important thing. The artist I was studying with, Janet Hayes in Melbourne, she used soft pastels, and I thought, aha, this is going to be what I'm going to do. I also, along the way, realised that it was landscape painting that gave me the feels, and I was going to be a landscape painter. But let me tell you a little bit about soft pastel colours. So this is obviously my greens, or one of the boxes of greens. These are vibrant and gorgeous, aren't they? That's because they're almost pure pigment. Many of us will remember what an insipid green blackboard chalk looked like. The reason that was so cheap and so insipid, it was mainly binding agent and almost no pigment. These are the other way round, they're almost pure pigment. They work in a similar way to a blackboard chalk, but they're a little bit softer, and you can manipulate them so well. Let's say that I start with this green, and I'll show you, I'll work on a bit on this surface. So I put a lot of that green on my surface, knock off any excess dust, pop the pastel that I've used on my very grand palette. It's a Tupperware lid and I've used it for decades. It served me well. And then I can push those particles of colour into that surface. But then, oh, I haven't quite got the green right. What can I do? Well, let's say I needed it a bit yellower. I'll take a more yellowy green out of my box and add just a bit of that on top. Again, popping it over there. Just pushing that into the surface, nudging that to a more yellowy hue. Can we all see? But oh, it's a bit dark, I need it a bit lighter. Okay, let's take a lighter pastel and just add a bit of that as well. And again, push it into the surface. And you can see that I'm nudging and manipulating that colour, so it's exactly the right tone and hue that I want. And if I need to remix that, I don't have to wait for it to dry. It's not going to change colour at all as it dries. And the three pastels that I used are just there, so I can remix it again really easily. Just one of the many reasons that I love soft pastels. Another reason is because you can easily eradicate mistakes. You can brush that, put those pastel particles off the surface, go back to this surface and remix. So if you accidentally make a stone wall go too far, or a tree's the wrong shape or something, you can change that. Obviously, if you do it too much, you scuff the surface, but being able to fix your mistakes as you go along was another wonderful thing about soft pastels. I'll just take that off my fingers. Of course, you do end up with pastels on your hands, but that's okay. The success of using pastels, however, all depends on using a gritty surface. So that surface I was working on there is like a fine sandpaper. It's got like a tooth, a grip. And that grip takes those little particles of pastel onto the surface. And I evolved those techniques that I learnt with Janet Hayes in Melbourne for the portraiture, and created a process for landscape painting with soft pastels. And what happens is I start with a piece of mount board, acid-free mount board, and then I get rid of the white, the daunting white. And here I do use acrylic paint. I just use big brush strokes and enjoy it. But I use sympathetic colours to the painting I'm going to create. And then once that's dry, I paint on a primer which leaves a fine sandpaper grittiness on the surface. I'll pass this round. If you start with your finger at the top of the purple, that's smooth, there's no primer there. But as you go down to the bottom, you'll feel that gritty surface that I work on. I don't want to interfere with coffee drinking, but there we are. I pass that round, you hopefully will see what I mean. So, oops, take it on this again. So eventually, I brought all this delicious knowledge, feeling that maybe I am becoming an artist, back to England, and eventually settled in Yorkshire. And certainly, some of my first paintings were very vibrant. I think I brought something of the Australian colour and light back with me. It's also probably because I had a smaller selection of soft pastels to work with, and so I had to choose colours carefully to show the joy and try and illustrate the moorland. But I certainly was enjoying it. I was living in Ilkley, and I was so lucky that I had the Dales on my doorstep to inspire me. But after a while, I began to look a bit more closely. So some places in the Dales have big horizontals and diagonals, and these places are quite green. This is Raydale that drains into Wensleydale. And other places, the moors are much more rounded, and these places tend to be more purple and brown and orange. So what's going on here? Well, these places, of course, up near Wensleydale are mainly limestone country. And what we're seeing, those horizontals, are the limestone strata that's the rock underneath, the limestone strata. And then the diagonals are where you've got the mudstone and siltstone layered between the limestone strata, which erode differently, they're softer, so they erode on a diagonal until you hit the next layer of limestone deep underground, and there you get the next escarpment or the next limestone plateau. And that explains the shape. But why so green? Well, it turns out that limestone is very permeable, so the water goes through it and it creates a very lush topsoil which supports grass. So the limestone areas are very, very green. However, the more these kind of places we get more rolling moors. Under here you've got Yorkshire sandstone, and that is far less permeable. So the topsoil tends to be peaty, and you get the heather and the cotton grass. So the very shape and the very colours that I was painting and observing and then painting were, of course, exactly so because of the rocks underneath. I thought I was going to be interested in geology and the rocks underneath, but it turned out I was. And I got very excited when I realised that the geologists also use visual symbols. Obviously, I'm a person who loves visual things. And they use these fantastic symbols, lithological symbols, to denote where the different rocks are. And they tend to put them in diagrams and on maps. But I tried to take these same symbols and put them into sketches and paintings. So here at the far end there is my sketch of Buckton Pike, with me attempting to put the lithological symbols in exactly the right places where that limestone and mudstone and siltstone actually are under the ground. I turned that into a painting, and the painting also had those symbols just tucked away. So the symbol of the limestone here, the sort of brickwork, and then the little dots and the little lines being the mudstones and the siltstones. So I was really enjoying geology. But it wasn't just looking at the shapes of the fells. I was looking, of course, at the shapes of the valleys as well. And in some places I saw that those valleys are very V-shaped. And in other places they're very U-shaped, flat valley bottom and steeper sides. Well, what's going on here? Well, I could take my mind back to my A-level geography. So this is a geographical issue. And here we have at the far side my painting of Swaledale, Upper Swaledale, as it swooshes round the corner with a very young river swale cutting out that V shape. But here is Upper Wharfdale with Kilnsey Crag. We're looking down the dale towards Grass Woods. Very much your U shape, your flat valley bottom and steeper valley sides. What has happened here? Well, of course, it was filled by a glacier, many glaciers, back in our last ice ages, 20-odd thousand years ago or more. And as those glaciers moved and melted and reformed, they eroded the landscape. So they eroded the valley sides, cutting out those steeper valley sides. And as they melted, they formed lakes. And the silt in the melting ice water fell to the bottom of the lake, and you've got a very flat, silty, fertile, flat valley bottom. And of course, at one point, one of our glaciers up there actually dug out the shape of Kilnsey Crag, and that's why we've got the overhanging rock there. And I love to think that actually some of the first sculptors in our land were in fact those glaciers from all those times ago. So I'm just going to move that back so I don't keep knocking it with my heel. But what happened with all this geology and geography is I became interested in the Yorkshire Dales as a whole. Now, most of us, I'm sure, have our favourite places that we go, our favourite places that we walk. I know myself and my husband certainly do. You know, we love Upper Wharfdale and Swaledale and Wensleydale. Anybody else got favourite places around the Yorkshire Dales that you go back to time and time again? Any ideas?
Nidderdale.
Nidderdale, there we go. A particular place in Nidderdale? Not sure.
The far end.
The big
Ha-
mall.
Hastings Gorge.
Oh yes.
And the end of
The end of
the
where
Dale.
those reservoirs, isn't there, and big open moors, lovely area, yes. Anybody else with favourites?
Round Reef.
Sorry?
Reef.
Reef, oh yeah, up
Arkangate.
high in Swaledale
Yeah,
where
yeah.
Arkangarthdale comes down and meets Swaledale, yeah. And the thing is, we have these favourite places, and because they're favourites and they're gorgeous, we go back to them time and time again. But I began wondering about the geology and the geography right across the national park. What else was there for me to explore? What if I got away from my favourite Nidderdale or my favourite Reef or my favourite Upper Wharfdale and explored other places? So some of you in the audience, or maybe most of you, will have read about this. So if you know the answer, perhaps don't put your hand up. But I decided I needed a project and I needed a definition for the project. And I would set out to try and explore and then paint all the named dales of the Yorkshire Dales National Park. Now, my map kind of gives it away a bit, but how many? I mean, we've got Big Wharfdale, we've got Nidderdale, we've got Airedale, big, majestic Wensleydale across the top, and then, of course, Swaledale higher up still. I've taken the map away, so you can't start counting them. How many dales do you think? I wrote to the rangers of the National Park and asked for a list. How many dales do we think was on the list? Anybody? Rough guesses.
42.
42. That, yeah, because that's the answer to everything. No, it isn't. But I mean, that's a hitchhiker's guide to the galaxy. I wish it had been 42. Any other guesses, anybody? 30. Somebody said 30. Sorry?
35.
Yeah, these are great guesses. Well, I was thinking 22, 25, you know, when I first wrote to the Rangers. So I was a bit aghast that their list, which they sent me, which I've written out over there, was 45. So more than 42. 45 named dales. And they sent me it in a beautiful way. Each main dale had the tributaries listed underneath, and any side tributaries were listed underneath that, which helped a lot when I tried to find them on my OS map. The thing is, shortly after that, this is in 2016, the National Park extended and took in a bit of Cumbria in the far northwest. And I said, oh, they're not dales, because of local dialect, they're called something else, they're valleys. I do not need to have them in my quest. But the National Park people said, well, please, Lucia, and I was about to do an exhibition with them up in Wensleydale, so I thought, okay, I'm going to have to agree to this. So into my project came Malastang, what a wonderful name, Rothay, Eden Valley and Loon Valley. So now I had 49 paintings to paint, which was, of course, a bit daunting. So I painted this map. I started, I wrote out the list, but then being a visual person, I painted this map. Here it is. And I didn't paint the roads and the towns. I put a couple of villages in just to orientate myself. We've got Kettlewell. I'm pointing here, but you can probably see we've got Kettlewell and we've got Hawes, just to orientate myself. But basically, this was a map of rivers, because the rivers were denoting where the valleys are and where the dales are and where I was going to be. But it was not going to result in 49 paintings of entire dales. I was going to have to go and explore each one. Back in that book that I read, The History of Art, Gombrich's book, I came across a quote by a landscape painter from 200 years ago, John Constable, and he said, I paint my own places best. And this really hit me. I thought, yes, you have to know a place. You have to go and feel it, experience it, walk in it, get wet there, have the wind in your hair, get lost probably, and stumble over a difficult stile. And then you really begin to experience the place. And you can also begin to know the excitement it gives you, and therefore you can begin to know what's hitting you about that place, what you want to capture, how you're going to simplify that, how you're going to augment it, and how you're going to put that into a painting. So I knew that that was going to be a process. Sounds clunky, but to me it's just sort of a natural way. In each place, I was going to go through that process as I explored there and walked there, and the result was going to be a collection of very different paintings. So at the top left over there, you've got a stone stile. This is my painting of Airedale. The stile, in fact, can be found up on Kringles near Bradley, but you're looking over that stile to the far fields and fells the other side of Airedale. So that's my painting of Airedale. Below, you've got just a close-up view, really, of some big fells in Littondale and the limestone escarpment there. So not the whole dale, just a piece of the dale. That painting became known as a little piece of Littondale. In the middle, although that looks like a bigger painting, it was in fact a smaller painting. And this is Barbandale, which, let me start to show you on this map. We're now, Barbandale is high up above Dentdale here, and it flows off to the west. I'd never been there before, but in Upper Barbandale, the fells are extremely steep. I didn't walk up that fell, and that's what really hit me. So that's what I had to focus on for my painting. Here, near me, here we've got the view from being high up in the Howgills. So this is part of that Cumbrian district that the Yorkshire Dales National Park brought into the park in 2016, and I'm looking a sort of elevated view of Rothay Valley, and so this was the painting that represented Rothay Valley. And here we have a painting called Bishop's Green, Lower Bishopdale. Now, you might not have heard of that, but you might have heard of the village West Burton. It's a very pretty village near Wensleydale, and that's where Bishopdale comes down and joins Wensleydale. And as that dale gets down towards Wensleydale, it becomes this classic U-shaped with very flat valley bottom and very lush pasture. A lot of lovely sheep farms there, and clearly this is great pasture for the sheep, and it's very lush, very verdant, very green. And so I painted that and called my painting Bishop's Green. But let me tell you more about how I used the map. So as I went along, this map was, I was able to be interactive with this map. And so at first when I painted it, all the names were just in pencil. And each time I actually completed a painting, I would open this out of its clip frame, allow myself to get it out and ink in the name of that dale. So gradually the dale names became inked in, and that's how I never ticked off a list, as it were. I ticked off everything on my map. As my quest, I called it the quest, as my quest got underway though, I realised that that map hadn't just painted the rivers and the valleys, it had painted all the in-between places. It had showed me just how connected our dales are. If you walk out the top of one, you very quickly get into the top of another. And I discovered I really loved walking in those high up, beautiful places. Here I am walking from Waldendale. Now, do we know where Waldendale is? It's here. It's very near that Bishopdale. It's here, flowing into Wensleydale, and I'm walking from Waldendale over the top into Upper Coverdale. Okay, that's where these photographs are of. And I love these huge high up places. You can feel very, very small under huge big skies. The vistas go on for ages. The busyness, any roads, any lorries thundering through, the towns, the villages kind of disappear. You can't see the valley bottoms anymore. And I find these places, often the weather, here was a good day, but often the weather can be pretty wild up there. But that's exhilarating, but it's also kind of restorative, and it soothes you, and you're away from the busyness of the normal world. I just feel these places are very, very good for the soul. And yeah, I began to realise that these were actually my real love. This turned out to be my painting of Walden Dale, there on the far left. One of the rare paintings that was in fact the whole dale. Walden Dale does not have a through road through it. If you go up, it's a dead end. And as you walk up towards the top of the valley, everything becomes very much quieter. There's no signal on your phone. There's a phone box. You can hear a distant tractor and a distant sheep. There's no lorries thundering through or any traffic at all. It felt like we were in a different time zone. So my painting became known as Walden Time, as if it has a different time zone all of its own. But walking up there and to the left, you're on those big moor tops that I showed you just now, and you're coming down into Upper Coverdale, and here the moors are beautifully barren and they're kind of dancing under the shadows and the sun of whatever's happening in the sky. Those are exhilarating places, aren't they? I called this painting A Place to Pirouette. I often reference dancing really, because I think these places make me feel like dancing. But I also allowed myself to embrace properly those in-between places. And this is actually the painting that represents Nidderdale. But I was up high, obviously walking up high in those moors. I'm in Upper Wharfdale, where you could see over to those upper moors, all around the top of Nidderdale there. And it's a celebration of those big open spaces, a celebration of those huge open skies and the Yorkshire weather coming at you. This painting was known simply as Between. But to find some of the other dales, some of these curious little hidden away dales and the tributaries, I needed to continue to walk between valleys, because that's where I was going to find. These are tributaries that come into Raydale. We saw Raydale earlier when I was talking about those horizontals and diagonals. And to get there, an easier way was, let me show you one here again. So Cragdale and Bardale are at the back of Raydale. But this is Upper Wharfdale, okay? This is Buckton. So if you go up beyond Buckton, you get to the little hamlet of Cray. And if you go up a little bit further, there's a lay-by and a track that goes off. And you can walk over the tops and down into Cragdale, or more like past Cragdale. So this was the way I decided I would go and find it. I thought that walking up from Cray, I was going to find myself in a very remote, uninhabited area, but in fact there was a bridle track, there were farmers going past on quad bikes, there were cattle grids, there were very well maintained fences and stone walls, etc. This is farming country. But as we began to drop down towards Raydale, this incredible vista opened out on our left. This was a big place with big fells and big moors. There didn't seem to be any bridle tracks going over into Cragdale. Some of the walls that we could see were broken and not maintained, so perhaps this area is less farmed these days, but it felt like a hidden treasure. The painting became known as Finding Cragdale. But I was still fascinated as I went along with all those geological and geographical stories. And of course, as you drop into Raydale, here we have the evidence of those Ice Age sculptors, the glaciers. Because of course summer water, which is tucked down here at the bottom of Raydale, so quite a few of us know summer water, the lake there, beautiful place, is in fact the remains of an Ice Age glacial meltwater lake. And I just love seeing those huge big stories still represented in our landscape. But I was finding some real oddities on my map as well. Here's Mossdale. I had to paint it on my map, that's where I found it on the OS map. It is a tributary to Wharfdale. So Mossdale Beck actually does flow into the River Wharfe. But how? Because on my map, it didn't look like they were connected. Now, if you start off from the village of Coniston near Kilnsey Crag, and you can walk up behind Coniston, you actually have to cross the Dales Way. So you don't turn left or right onto the Dales Way, you keep going onto those upper moor plateaus. And this is the kind of scenery that greets you, and it's a bit odd. It's quite easy walking. Again, you're on a bridle track a lot of the way, well-marked footpaths. But ahead of you, you're looking for this curious Mossdale, and gradually you can see that there is in fact a little upper valley ahead of you. It's a curious place. On one side you see rolling heathered moors, And on the other side, you can see clear limestone escarpments, and it's much greener. So Mossdale has two very curious different sides to it. It's an odd place indeed. But even odder, as you walk towards it, you can hear the gushing noise of a huge big waterfall. Okay, you can't compute that in your mind because you can't see anywhere in the landscape where water could be falling that far to make such a big gushing noise. But as you get really, really close, it becomes apparent what's going on. Mossdale Beck runs across this gorgeous little upper valley, and then it reaches the base of a little limestone escarpment, and it gushes down a great big pothole there. And so it's an underground waterfall that you're hearing. It really is quite noisy. I'm not quite sure how far it drops as it goes down the pothole, but that became my painting. And the rangers, I asked the rangers, well, where does that join the River Wharf? And they said they had done an experiment years before with some dye, and it joins the River Wharf underground, obviously, below Grass Woods. So it travels really quite a long distance, this water, before it joins our lovely River Wharf. Strange names on my map. Now, in the introduction, we mentioned Apedale, A-P-E, Dale, okay? So where is this strangely named place? It's above Castle Bolton in Wensleydale, okay? So it's on Grinton Moor. It's between Reeth, it's near Reeth. So between Reeth, if you walk up onto Grinton Moor and over to Castle Bolton, you will go past this wonderful place, Apedale. Now, we've been there, and my husband can verify with me there are no monkeys there, okay? Which was quite a relief. There's no monkeys there. A long time ago in the 19th century, it was full of industry, iron ore and coal mining industry. There was even a little railway there that was taking out that coal and iron ore. And there is a house, a remaining house there. But any other sign of that industry has now really just become rubble and heaps of stone. But 1,000 years before that, there was an invading Norse people who settled here, and they were called the Appi. A-P-P-I. So the valley of the Appy gradually became Apedale. And I can really understand why they chose this place. This gorgeous upper valley, there was lots of fresh water there, lots of springs. You've got a rim of moorland, so good lookout, sort of defensive position, and it would have been lightly wooded, so it would have had a lot of firewood. So it would have been a really great place to settle. I love finding those ancient stories. These days, as I said, there's very little sign of all that inhabitation. You really just have the grouse for company, and it's a beautiful, quiet place. So I sat and watched the grouse for a while and studied their flight patterns. I wanted to accurately put those flight patterns into my painting. The grouse are just depicted, they're just very small, just over there. Important to me that they were accurate though. And I feel that despite humankind's best efforts, Mother Nature has reclaimed this, or has started to reclaim this place, and so I called my painting Untamed. Another strange name that I found on my map. I'm now going to take you to the west. We're going to zoom around this map now quite a bit. I'm taking you over to near Ingleton, and above Ingleton there's two valleys, but here we are in Kingsdale. King, as in royalty, Kingsdale. As we approached it, we realised here is a very U-shaped valley. You can see that very classic valley, flat valley bottom, surrounded on the three sides by the fells. But in fact here, there's a fourth slope as well. So this lush pasture is in fact surrounded on four sides. Why is there a lip to the valley? This again is because of the glaciers. There's something called a moraine lip, and when the glaciers melt in a certain way, they dump a load of debris at the mouth of a valley, and that's what's happened here. The little River Twist, it's not the River Kings, it's the River Twist that comes through here, breaks through that moraine lip to flow down into Ingleton waterfalls. But nevertheless, this valley feels like a sort of almost an oval shape, protected on four sides. So I'm thinking, okay, there is a road through here, perhaps that was an ancient track. Perhaps once upon a time there was a royal carriage carrying an important queen or king through this gorgeous place. Well, and that's maybe why it's called Kingsdale. Well, in fact, no. Kingsdale is derived from K-N Dale, spelled like that. Why am I in front of the... Oh, sorry. It's just the projector that's there by your shoulder, thank you. Kingsdale is derived from K-N Dale, K-Y-E-N, Dale, which means the place that we keep the cows. Because of course, that lush pasture, that flat valley bottom, and being surrounded on 4 sides was a brilliant place to keep livestock. So a completely different start to a name that it gradually evolved into Kingsdale, which felt it should be royal, but in fact was just to do with cows. I wanted to keep a nod to my royal ideas in my painting, however, and the second time we went back there, it was a beautiful day, gorgeous, deep blue sky and the clouds dancing, and rather than celebrating another U-shaped valley, I wanted to celebrate the gorgeous limestone escarpments and scree and the fells, which are very spectacular near here. But I made sure that the sky needed a deep blue, so I could call my painting Royal Blue as a nod to that fantastic story. I kept finding stories all over the place. I came back nearer home for this one. This is Dibdale. Now, Dibdale is a little dale. It connects Grimwith Reservoir to Wharfdale. So Grimwith Reservoir is in fact the River Dib, dammed up. And so it's not a long walk, but I don't actually recommend the walk. I'm going to say that quite a few times in the next 20 minutes. That it's because that not many people walk here. The paths are quite overgrown with thistles and nettles, and there's barbed wire and tumble down stiles to get through, etc. Dibdale used to be full of industry, another place that used to be full of industry. Here it was lead mining, and there was a hamlet called Dib, D-Y-B-B-E. But in fact the Dale is now spelt D-I-double-B, Dibdale. There's no sign of that hamlet. There's no sign of that industry there. Instead, this gorgeous little valley that swoops down and joins Wharfdale is full of trees. So I decided to call my painting Green Gold, because it's a different kind of treasure, totally, isn't it? But in terms of lifestyle, there was a couple of lovely stories I found about the hardiness of people around the Yorkshire Dales. This is Grisdale. Now again, I'll show you on my map, Grisdale. Where are we? We're right over here, this is Garsdale. So Grisdale is this little valley that flows into Grisdale and out to Sedbergh and off to the west, okay? Sadly, Grisdale got described in the 1970s as the Dale that died. This is the place that we mentioned in my intro, the Dale that died. How terribly sad. What had happened is there'd been a few harsh winters and most of the farmers found it just too difficult. It's a remote place, there's only one road in, it must have got very snowed in. And in the 70s, only one farm was still farmed and inhabited. There was lots of derelict and abandoned farms. Roll on a couple of decades, and some of those things, that remoteness and that peacefulness, the very things that the farmers found difficult, had become actually things that some people wanted. And some of those farms got bought up and redeveloped and refurbished and lived in again. And I read that in 2019, the population was back to the pre-1970 levels. And of course that's before COVID, so I'm imagining even more of the derelict buildings that we saw when we walked there are now inhabited and refurbished. So it's another difficult place to walk. Thistles, nettles, footpaths that disappear into bogs. But nevertheless, it's inhabited again, and the buildings are being cherished and loved. And the day we were there, it danced under the gorgeous shadows and the pools of light that were flowing across the land. So the painting became known as Dancing Again. A different kind of lifestyle yet again. Now, here we are now in upper Swaledale, a little tiny valley called Whitsunndale. Now, as you look at this painting, it might unnerve you, deliberately so. So the clouds have been allowed to escape from the sky. The sheep are not contained by any stone wall. They can just wander where they wish. There's one lone barn that's kind of a bit inexplicable. I called this painting Escape, and this is a nod to the story of the people that live here. There's one main farm in Whitsunndale, and it's Ravenseat. That's what it's called, isn't it? Yeah, Ravenseat. It is, of course, the farm of the Yorkshire shepherdess, this lady called Amanda Owen. So she brought her extraordinary family up in this place, just down the road from that barn. So I was questioning that amazing lifestyle, which obviously mesmerises a lot of us, but what kind of escapism is that? A different kind of escapism. So I wanted to have a nod to that in my painting. But let's stick at boundaries. I began to have problems with boundaries myself. So on my list from the Yorkshire Dales Rangers, it said that there were 3 dales that are actually east of Arkengarth Dale, so we're going right off to the east of the park, and they're called Moorsdale, Arnsdale and Skegdale. And when I first put these paintings on my social media, I got lots of kickback, and people going, no, you've got this wrong. This is wrong. These places are not in the Yorkshire Dales National Park. And I thought, well, the Rangers have put them on their list, so I'm going with that. And we found them on the map. But it is true, it's only the upper reaches of these dales that are in the national park. So that's where we went walking. But of course, again, difficult footpaths, thistles, nettles, bogs, barbed wire, difficult to get to. And on a very grey, gloomy day as well. But it was wonderful. It was wonderful. There was really nobody else there apart from a couple of farmers. The weather was exhilarating. The big vistas were fantastic. But it felt like quite a challenging place. So I decided I would challenge myself in the way I was going to paint these. And they're painted a bit differently. So what I did is I painted the skies in soft pastel. And then I had those scanned and put onto canvas, so that I could finish off the landscape with my acrylic paints and a brush. Because no matter what I say, every now and then I do actually quite like using a brush. I often say, no, I like the immediacy of the pastels in my fingers, but it was nice to go back using a brush and the sort of rich, heavy colour, if you like, of acrylics for these 3. I called them on the edge, because I think the whole process pushed me a little bit to the edge as well as these places being on the edge. Another place, oh no, I've got to tell you about, no, I think I've missed one, hang on, there we are. Another place on the edge, so that was right over there in the east. We're going right back to the west of the national park. So there's a place called Lonsdale. Now, earlier on we were talking about Kingsdale, that's the River Twiss. Not all the dales are called after their rivers. We probably know that with Wensleydale being the River but you've got the River Twiss coming down Kingsdale, joining the River Doe coming down Dodale, joining just below Ingleton Falls to become the River Greta. And the River Greta is the river of Lonsdale. But there's a bit of a problem for me, because only 1/3 of the mile of the River Greta is in the national park, and that 1/3 of a mile flows through Ingleton mainly, and it's basically the people of Ingleton have built a big concrete gully, those of you that know Ingleton, where this little river flows. It's probably quite a flood risk, and they've built a very deep concrete gully so it gets off out to the west before it floods the town. So how was I going to paint this place? Well, instead of trying to figure that out in Ingleton, I decided I'd go back to some of my favourite places, the Upper Fells, and I walked up out of Ingleton back towards into the National Park, where I could get some bigger views. And looking out to the west, out across the top of Ingleton, on this beautiful late afternoon, wintry kind of day, we turned round and the sun was setting, and this vista was incredible. It was beautiful. The sky was huge and gorgeous. The landscape just danced with the shadows and bits of light. And I thought, well, that really is Lonsdale. It's over there. That's what I need to paint. So I painted this, and I called it Over There. But of course, the big problem is that although I was stood in the national park when I painted this is in fact not only outside the national park, but it's Lancashire. I painted Lancashire. I'm very, very glad it sold and it found a new home. I knew it was contentious. I wanted the quest to become a variety, so it was. On the Rangers map, there was the dale called Oldale. U-L Dale. Oldale. Very strange. Now, I found lots of references to Oldale on my OS map, but only one of these references seemed to be anywhere near Swaledale. And on the Rangers list, it was very clear that the Oldale I needed to find was a tributary of Swaledale. And so we eventually found this Oldale Beck waterfall his upper Swale Dale with all these, it's got a lot of little tributaries. And the old dale that we found is here, right up here at the top, okay? And on the map, it was another kind of Mossdale experience. It looked like Old Dale Beck flowed over some upper moorland and then went down a waterfall and disappeared. So parking the car on the one road up there, a couple of miles away, we were faced with boggy moorland going across quite a huge piece of fell and then up quite a huge ascent before we needed to get up onto that upper plateau to find Old Dale Beck and this waterfall. We set off, but there were really no footpaths, so kept following sheep trails, obviously, which kept petering out into bogs, and it became worrying for our ankles, really. So before we really started that steep ascent, we'd been walking for about an hour. We thought, no, we better be safe here, and we'll retrace our steps to the car. And as we were retracing our steps to the car, and I stopped for a breather and a look around, which obviously is something I love to do, I turned back and I saw this incredible pattern coming down the moorside from the spot where the waterfall was on my map and all the way down the hillside towards Swaledale. And I realised that Old Dale Beck is another piece of water that disappears underground and must join the River Swale further down. And what I was actually seeing was an ancient river course that little Old Dale Beck took. Here was this gorgeous swooshing, swaying pattern that we tried to walk across. And it's boggy in places, but it was a beautiful, just a pattern, and I wanted to celebrate that in my painting, which is called the swale, because I discovered a swale. One definition of swale, there's several, but one is a low-lying, boggy place. Well, this certainly was that. So never actually seen Old Dale Beck. One day maybe, but maybe with a drone camera or something, I don't know. I'm still not quite sure if we got Old Dale right, but I enjoyed painting this gorgeous pattern, nevertheless. There was an area, of course, that was a lot easier to find, and this is the area of the Yorkshire Three Peaks. We've all know, I'm sure, Whernside and Ingleborough and Pennygent. Of course, the issue was those are the fells, and I'm meant to be focusing on the named dales, but of course each of those fells has one of the named dales, or several of the named dales, next to it. My painting of Ribblesdale turned out to be the view from the top, or coming down Whernside. So this painting here is actually looking down towards the viaduct plateau. Now, it doesn't contain the viaduct. You can't see the viaduct in my painting. That's quite deliberate. I often left out the more iconic thing because I was wanting to bring attention to all these glorious dales throughout the national park, not just those iconic things that we know. So it doesn't feature the viaduct at all. That's just sort of tucked out of my painting to the right. But those upper fells do swoop down off to the right and down to Ribblesdale and Horton in Ribblesdale and so on. This strange painting here on the right is, however, something different. I'll just digress for a minute. After I finished the quest, I realised how much I loved maps. And I realised the contours that we see on the maps that the OS people find very carefully and accurately made fascinating patterns. But we often don't see them because the maps are lots of other things on them, the roads and so on. So what I did is I took the maps and I simplified them, I hand drew them bigger, enlarged them, and then I painted Whernside and Ingleborough and Pennygent in a very different way. This is, if you like, an aerial view of those contours. So this is Whernside, but painted very differently. The series got known as A Different View. If you look at the pattern of Whernside, you see it kind of goes to a point up there. Ingleton falls down past that point, and I'm going to take you onto these fells right now. Here we are. This fell. So the background highest purple fell that you can see is in fact Whernside, but this is walking on the fell between Kingsdale and Dodale. I'd never heard of Dodale. D-O-E, Dodale, the River Doe, and it flows down the valley on this side of my painting. And of course, the other side of Dodale is Ingleborough, that big, majestic, fantastic silhouette of Ingleborough. But this fell, these lower slopes of Whernside are beautiful in their own right. Gorgeous walking, lovely limestone pavements to see, huge views all the way around. So I call my painting Overshadowed, because of course it is overshadowed by Ingleborough, and we very rarely take the time to look at Dodale. I couldn't, however, resist putting one of the three peaks into my quest. Here's Pennygent, a painting called Pennygent Speaks. But in fact, this represents Silverdale. The swooping slopes this side go down into Silverdale and up again onto Fountains Fell. So this is the painting that represented Silverdale. But again, here's the different view of Pennygent. I kept putting off Wensleydale. Wensleydale was a real problem. I mean, we all know where it is, and it's iconic and beautiful and majestic. But the thing is, it's so beautiful, so majestic, so big. Wensleydale has so many sides to her character. Somehow in my brain she's female, but just allow me that. So many different sides of the character. What was I going to paint? Was I going to paint the big top fells and the swooping skirts of the patterns of fields coming down to the valley bottom? Was I going to paint the strange fell tops themselves with the limestone knolls up there and the big limestone plateaus? That's Adelborough. Was I going to paint elsewhere the big rolling moor tops? This third one is Weatherfell, and you're looking straight across the valley towards the moors that go up over Buttertub's Pass, these huge open gorgeous places that I love to walk. Or was I in fact going to paint the rolling valley bottom with the very classic rolling fields and the little stanzas of trees rolling there because of the Ice Age. These are Ice Age drumlins where the glacier has dumped debris and then smoothed it. All these different characters, how was I going to handle Wensleydale? I pretty much inked in all the other dales and Wensleydale remained in pencil. Well, we were staying up near Hawes, and on a wet afternoon, I'd been out walking, trying to find the one iconic view and failing. And I got my sketchbook out, a load of photographs, and I thought, I'll just doodle. And I doodled this. I literally doodled this. And I realised what was going to have to happen is I was going to paint 4 paintings of Wensleydale. I was going to have to paint, indeed, those upper fells and those big skirts of fields sweeping down to the valley bottom. I was, of course, going to have to celebrate those strange limestone knolls and the big limestone plateaus. I was, of course, going to have to celebrate these upper moors where the footpaths take you on amazing adventures. And, of course, I needed to celebrate the rolling fields in the valley bottom with their gorgeous stanzas of trees. And so it was going to be 52 paintings of those 49 dales. I'm going to take you back to one last dale. We haven't talked about literature yet, but I found a delicious story linking to literature in this place. This is Malham Dale. Now the cove is off to the left. I didn't want to get distracted by the cove. I wanted to try and explore Malham Dale as a whole. In the distance we can see the entrance into Gordale Scar, and just below that in some of the trees it will be Janet's Foss. But here I am above the hamlet of Kirby Malham. And I'd seen on my map that there was quite a lot of footpaths going off Kirby Malham. So we parked there and we were going to head up this field, and we did, and we turned around halfway up and saw this view, which was fantastic. And we'd only just set out on the walk, but I thought, this is the view. But I knew that as well because we'd had an interesting conversation as we parked the car with an elderly resident in Kirby Malham. And he said, did you know Bill Bryson used to live here? The author? And I was like, no. And Bill Bryson evidently rented property here for several years as he wrote his book, Notes from a Small Island. And on the final pages of that book, he describes the view. And it's this view with the church tower and the rolling fields and Gordale Scar, etc. in the background. But he describes it as if you can see it from the lane that links over to Settle. And our new friend Brian from Kirby Malham explained it doesn't matter where you go up and down that lane, you can't see this view because you can't see the church tower from the lane. And we tried, we drove up and down the lane, and he was really right. You cannot see the church tower anywhere on that lane. But Bill Bryson had a favourite morning walk with his dog evidently, and it was up this field. And so halfway up this field, it's quite steep, halfway up you turn around and you get this view. And so this is the view, of course, that I painted. And at the end of Bill Bryson's book, it's on literally on the last few pages of that book, if you happen to have it, he says that this view epitomises why he loves England, why he loves Yorkshire, and why he loves all of our quirkiness. And of course he's an American and he's talking from that perspective, but for him this epitomises all of it, which obviously gave me a title for this painting, which just simply I entitled All of It. Of course, I know that there's an awful lot of other places that I haven't yet painted in the Yorkshire Dales National Park. There's lots of tributaries that are not something dale, and there's an awful lot more in between places. So I'm going to hopefully keep exploring and enjoying and finding those. But I'm hoping that what I've done this morning is inspire you to go and find new to you places, to keep exploring, to stay curious as you go along, but most of all, just to keep enjoying the journey.